Hey, this is Dontcalltechsupport. Today we're taking a look at the performance of Anno 1800. We're going to start off by looking at the performance of the different presets with an i5 6600K at 4.8 GHz paired with a GTX 1070 and an R9 290. Then we're moving on to looking at the performance on a few different test systems. I won't be going through the specs of those this time because I'm trying to keep the video shorter. So if you want to know the specs, look down in the description. I tested with the camera panning around the town I built, which you can see on screen now. I tried to keep things as equal as possible. All numbers are 1080p. I'm usually using VSR to test different resolutions, but this game is just crashing every time I change the resolution or the windowed mode, so we're just sticking with 1080p full screen. So for this first test, we're just looking at the averages. With the low preset, the R9 290 pushes more frames than the GTX 1070 for some reason, at 129.3 frames per second for the 290 and 115.7 for the 1070. Upping the quality to medium and things return to what you'd expect, with the 1070 pushing just under 100 frames per second and the R9 290 doing 85.6 frames per second. If we up things to high, that cuts the performance of the R9 290 in half, going to 42.6 frames per second. The 1070 takes a bit less of a hit and managed to stay above 60 frames per second with 66.6 frames per second average. Upping things to very high makes the old 290 struggle and barely cross 30 frames per second on average at 31.2 frames per second. The 1070 is doing quite a bit better and managed 54.6 frames per second. Now to the ball buster that is Ultra. The 1070 is now down in the 30s at 35.4 frames per second, and the R9 290 is really struggling at 26.4 frames per second. Well, there we can see that anything above medium is making the R9 290 really works for the frames. This could be due to the 4 GB of VRAM, which was all gobbled up. 1070 is not really getting a workout because the usage never hit 100%, not even with 8 times MSAA of the Ultra preset. Even in DirectX 12 mode, this game is seriously dependent on single core performance, as we shall see in the following numbers. Also, the game needs a restart for the slightest change in graphics settings apart from windowed mode and resolution. But as you already know, the game crashes every time I change those, so well, it's forcing a restart either way, really. Well, enough complaining. Let's see how the AMD CPUs handle the 1070 in this game. Let's start things with the Ultra preset. Well, the Ryzen is only slightly behind the i5 6600K despite the Intel's 1.1 GHz clock advantage, with 35.4 frames per second for the i5 and 32.2 frames per second for the Ryzen on average. The FX8350 is lagging behind at 25.4 frames per second average, and the game would constantly crash on startup with the Phenom, so that's why it's absent from this chart. Well, let's move down to the high preset. Oh there, yes, well here the clock speed and single core performance advantage of the i5 becomes apparent. It was the only CPU that managed to stay above 60 frames per second on average. The Ryzen did 46.9 frames per second, with equally worse frame times. The FX8350 did the worst of the bunch, barely keeping above 30 frames per second. Well, swapping up to 1070 for the R9 290 and continuing with the high preset, here the FX8350 actually does ever so slightly better with the 1070 than the Ryzen, closing in on 40 frames per second with 37 frames per second on average, beating out the Ryzen. Although this is probably due to margin of error. The Intel takes the crown with 42.6 frames per second average. The game would actually start with the Phenom II with this GPU, and it did a rather uninspiring 22.8 frames per second with quite bad frame times. Upping the quality to Ultra again sees the performance tank. None of the CPUs managed to cross 30 frames per second here, which means we have a serious GPU bottleneck, as you'd expect with the old R9 290. The Intel is the fastest with 26.4 frames per second on average, and again the FX does slightly better than the Ryzen with 25.9 frames per second versus 23.9 frames per second. Again, the Phenom is last, but it isn't too far behind the others this time due to the GPU being the limitation. Still, 20.9 frames per second is not really playable in my opinion. Now on to the entry-level hardware, the Pentium G4620 and the GTX 1050. The high preset is a bit optimistic with this setup, as we can see. 24.3 frames per second is better than what the Phenom could do with a more powerful graphics card, but it's not a very fluid experience. Moving to medium makes the game playable. 39.2 frames per second is okay, despite the bad frames at times. Moving further down to the low preset, and the game is pretty good actually. 59.5 frames per second on average is a decent result. There is the odd frame dip here and there, but overall very playable. I would probably go for the medium preset if I were to play with this setup. I was disappointed that this game was so poorly optimized for multi-core CPUs, when that is definitely a shift we're seeing more and more these days. What with the new Zen 2 announcement the other day with the 12 core and possibly 16 core later. I will revisit this game when the Ryzen 3000 series is out, because I am looking to get the 6-core version so I can do 4 generations of 6-core AMD CPUs. And until then, have a great day or great days. Now I'm off to building my empire. Goodbye.